Well, I'm going to switch from the very, very, very big question of how the mind works to just the very big question of how language works. The starting point here is what I consider to be a miracle of the natural world. Think about what you're doing right now. You are sitting, listening to a man make noise while he exhales. Now, why would you do that? It's not because the sounds are particularly pleasant, but it's because I have packed information into the exact sequence of hisses and hums and squeaks and pops. Your brain has the ability to extract that information, allowing us to share ideas. Now, in the next part of the talk, I will talk about that talent, language, but if I made slightly different sounds, I could be talking about anything from theories of the origin of the universe to the latest developments in your favorite sports team or reality show or political context. The miracle of language, then, is its vast expressive power. How is it possible for human beings to share such a huge range of ideas just by making noise with their mouths? Well, I have suggested that there's not one trick behind this ability, but two tricks. The first trick is the memorized word. The great linguist Ferdinand de Saussure said that the key to language is the arbitrary sign, a connection between a signal and a concept. The word duck, for example, as there's a cliche in English, it doesn't look like a duck or walk like a duck or quack like a duck, but I can use it to make you think the thought of a duck because all of us at some point in our childhoods have memorized the association between that sound and that meaning. And that means that we have to have something stored in memory, and a simple version of it might look something like this. We have an entry in memory for the word in our mental dictionary. We've got some kind of representation of its sound, and then some kind of representation of its meaning. But of course, we don't just blurt out individual words. We combine them into bigger words and phrases and sentences in such a way that the meaning of the combination can be computed from the meanings of the individual words and the way that they are arranged. The trick behind rules is that they can be combined or assembled into bigger and bigger units. One rule can snap into another rule, then the words can fit into their slots in the grammatical rules, allowing you to generate new combinations of words from the same fixed set of rules. Now, how would you test this hypothesis that language has this two-part design, that it has memorized words and it has rules or algorithms or computations that you execute in real time? Well, one proof of that would be to find some kind of idea or meaning that can be expressed either by the word system or by the rule system. And I think we do have that test case. It's what you might remember from grammar classes as the difference between regular and irregular forms. In English, for example, verbs like walk, jog, and kiss are regular. They form the past tense all in the same way. Walk, walked, jog, jogged, kiss, kissed, and so on. I looked up some Portuguese examples, and in Portuguese as well, there are regular rules for the first person and the second person, first person plural, past, and so on. Now, these are completely predictable. Verb after verb after verb are formed in exactly the same way, in the case of the English past tense by adding the suffix ed. It's an open-ended class. There are thousands of existing regular verbs, and new ones are being added to the language all the time. I don't know if that works the same way in Portuguese, but I expect that it does. When there is a new verb, like is to blog a verb in Portuguese? Everyone knows how to conjugate it, how to form the past tense and the plural. You don't have to go to the dictionary. You simply apply the rule. Likewise to spam, to fax, and so on. Now, even children show this creativity. If you bring a child into the lab and say, here is a man who knows how to wug. Now, wug is not an English verb. It's just made up for the experiment. You say to children, he did the same thing yesterday. Children will fill in the blank and say wugged, a form that they could not have heard from their parents because it doesn't exist. It's a made-up word. But it shows that they have the mental equivalent of the rule add ed to form the past tense. And this is when they're 4 years old. It's not something they learned in school. We also see children show off this talent for creativity in errors they make, like in English, we holded the baby rabbits. The correct form is we held the baby rabbits. Again, they didn't memorize holded from their parents because adults never say holded, they only say held. So they must have created it in real time in their minds. Now this brings me to the second kind of verb, the irregular verbs. In contrast to the regular forms, the irregular forms are idiosyncratic and unpredictable. In English, the past of sink is sank. The past of cling, though, is not clang, it's clung. So you cannot predict from a verb's sound what its irregular form will be. Also, the irregulars form a closed fixed class. In English, there are 165 irregulars. I couldn't find any source that told me exactly how many there are in Portuguese, but it's probably also in the hundreds, and then that's the end, compared to the thousands of regular verbs. Well, here's a simple psychological theory of what goes on in the mind when a person is using these two kinds of verb. In the case of irregular forms, they're just more words, and you memorize them the same way you memorize duck and dog and cat and man and so on. You have an entry in memory for bring. You've got a separate entry in memory for brought, but these are otherwise two different entries in memory, which are linked together, but each one occupies a separate slot. Whereas regular forms, you don't need to memorize the past tense, because whenever you need it, you can just create it with a rule, add the suffix, and you could even throw it away, not remember it at all, because the next time you need to use it in the past tense, you just create it all over again with the rule. And this would be the same kind of rule that you use in grammar and syntax. And this would be the same kind of memory entry that you use when you learn words in general. In this case, they just happen to be two different mechanisms for expressing the same concept, namely something that happened in the past. Now this leads to the question of where do regular and irregular verbs come from? And there's interesting information in the statistical structure of the language. Again, I'll use the examples from English, but it works the same way in Portuguese. So if you were to take a rank list of the most frequently used words in the language, this is what you get in English. And these are number of occurrences per million words of text. Be, have, do, say, make, go, take, I can't even read my own slide, come and say and get. Notice that all of those are irregular. Be, was, have, had, do, did, say, said, make, made, and so on. And again, the same is true in Portuguese. These are some of the most commonly used verbs in Portuguese, and notice that all of them are irregular. It's almost as if the language is trying to torture people who are learning it as a second language. The verbs that you use all the time are the ones that you have to memorize the irregular conjugations. Now you look at the verbs at the bottom of the list, say words that occur 1 in a million times instead of 20,000 in a million, Here's what you get in English: abate, abbreviate, and so on. These are very unusual academic words. Common words are irregular. The rare verbs are regular. And this is true in most languages. Well, there is a simple psychological explanation, which is that irregulars depend on memory. Because they're unpredictable, you have to memorize them one at a time. Memory depends on frequency. The more often you hear something, the better it sticks in memory. If words rise and fall in popularity, just like any other bit of culture, if a word declines in popularity to the point that it's not memorized uniformly by a generation of children, then speakers will default to the rule, add ed, converting the verb from irregular to regular for their generation and for all subsequent generations. And there's evidence that this is true in the case of English. If you go back in history, if you look at English as it was spoken in the time of Chaucer or before, in the Middle Ages or even before, there were twice as many irregular verbs as there are today. You can do an analysis of the common and rare verbs in Middle English, and you find that the common or high-frequency verbs stayed irregular. The lower frequency or rare verbs switched from irregular to regular. And so this is a kind of process of Darwinian natural selection, but occurring not for organisms, but for words, where instead of survival and reproduction being the criterion, here it's memorization by children is the criterion, but nonetheless one sees a survival of the fittest and one sees an evolution over time. In the case of language, it's over centuries rather than tens of thousands of years, but it is in some ways a similar process.
Você acompanhou a primeira parte da conferência com o psicólogo canadense Steven Pinker. Na semana que vem, você assiste a segunda parte dessa palestra, aqui na URGS TV.